So, welcome to the Exploring Humanity podcast again. And today I got Victor on from the Mind Foundation in Berlin. And I'm excited to have Victor on because I actually did a training with the Mind Foundation, which was really, really great. I think it was approximately a week or so, where Victor was one of the lead facilitators there. And it was such a great experience. I can really recommend it. And since then, I wanted to get him here on the podcast. So, welcome, Victor.
Welcome, Thomas. I'm happy to be here and to explore these discussions and the areas of psychedelic integration, the work we're doing at Mind, and the experiences we're having, and the beauty of just being alive and being able to have these experiences, to reflect on them, and to do so with a discerning attitude and with
Yeah.
driven by values. So.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think part of what I really liked about the Mind Foundation is exactly that so many things are popping up around psychedelics at the moment. But I really felt, like you said, that Mind Foundation have somehow integrated some really solid values and ethics around how they engage with this and these substances and provide information, advice, and training. And even I know the integrity that you put into your training, because you also have a training obviously for people who want to do this in a therapeutic setting, and I'm aware you obviously also delayed that because you really wanted to make sure it's spot on. So I know the Mind Foundation have a lot of integration or a lot of integrity, which is why I'm super happy to have you here. And I know just before we started the podcast, I was obviously sharing a little bit about how psychedelics impacted me and my nervous system and how it helped me be able to regulate and cope much more when the different stress factors of life that's inevitable come and visit. And I'm just really curious about whatever you feel comfortable sharing, how your journey was getting into this space and how you ended up with the Mind Foundation, etc.
Mm. Thank you for the question. It's indeed quite a ride it has been. I haven't always been interested in in the psychedelic field or in kind of topics related to that or to human development. So I did my back a while ago. I did my undergraduate at Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics, and after that I went into strategy consulting in London. And it was during that time that I encountered actually psychedelics for the first time.
Mhm.
And it was actually, I was not very well myself. I was in a period of which I think I was suffering from depression. But at that time, I wasn't necessarily very wise or emotionally mature. So I wasn't really open to therapy or other modalities. But I did do research about potential promising things, and one of them was MDMA. So I never had any sort of kind of MDMA experience or ecstasy experience in any sort of party setting, like some people do, up until that point. But decided to have one on my own to see if that will help, and that actually did help me a lot in the short term, and it opened me up. And then it also, obviously, because I had also some preconceptions about
Mhm.
psychedelics and on different sorts of substance classes, as not really having any sort of real benefit, but more being kind of a hedonistic pursuit or a harm in the worst case. That kind of opened me up. And then I did more research, I read around, and I started to have some experiences with classical psychedelics, among them LSD as well. And it was actually a particularly unfortunate experience that turned out to be one of the most transformative, one in which basically I ended up, without me wanting to, ingesting in a not in a good set and setting, and we'll get back more to set and the importance of set and setting, I think, also later, but in a challenging set and setting, a very large dose of LSD, because the person I took it from had mislabeled the right and the wrong doses, the microdoses and the large doses. So that kind of propelled a very, very powerful experience that took me years to properly integrate, and but also kind of opened me up to the possibilities. And after that, it was a journey in which I first started, because I came. I mean, there was a little bit of context here. I came from the strategy consulting world, the analytical world at Oxford. So I was very much in contact with scientific, rational principles, a very efficient, pragmatic mentality. but much less so with anything that goes towards kind of secular spirituality or values or all these things. So I wanted to explore that further. And I went to Nepal for a while. I did all sorts of retreats and trainings. And then I studied a master's in consciousness studies and transpersonal
Mhm.
psychology, and did all sorts of continued formations and workshops to be able to become ultimately a psychedelic integration facilitator.
Thank you for sharing,
So
Victor. And what a
that's in a
yeah.
nutshell, really.
Yeah, but so it's such a fascinating, and I know the story that you shared with us of the overdose and the impact it had on your life and the challenges was really an amazing story. We obviously don't have full time because it's like a proper long story, but it's incredible to hear, you know, your transformation. And I resonate a lot because I came very much from a place of science, very much be stuck in logic, very disembodied, I think, way of engaging with the
Mm,
world. And I think what psychedelic did was it opened me up to different aspects of myself that I wasn't even aware of was there, that I was probably very critical of before. And I'm just reading an interesting book on interoception, which there's so much research on, you know, how we can notice the body, the impact of being able to notice the body and regulate. And that was something that I was not even engaged or aware of back then. While now, I think the main way I navigate my decisions is actually paying attention to the body and notice what's happening in the body at any given moment. So it's just fascinating how much can change as this flexibility of mind happens, right? That can be facilitated by psychedelic journeys. But I'm really curious because you also mentioned it took you, I think you said several years to integrate that experience right after you had a too high a dose, but also how impactful. And that maybe brings us on to this topic of integration in itself, which I think you had a lot of experience with, and also Mind Foundation obviously is involved with and training people in. And I'm really curious about if you could talk a bit more about why it's important to have this integration, which often I think is neglected. People just want the excitement, taking a psychedelics, having an experience, meeting the spiritual world, but then neglect a little bit the integration part. Why is that important? And also, what is a good way to engage with that? That would be amazing if you can share a bit.
Sure, sure. So why it's important and how we could do it in a good way. I mean, ultimately, I need to kind of do a little bit of a bracketing here and to say that obviously I speak from like anyone from a biased perspective, but I want to be transparent with my biases. So I think at Mind we have this value, and I also share this value that the purpose of why we have psychedelic experiences, or why we could have these experiences as healthy individuals. So outside, I'm not
Mhm.
talking about the context of therapy, which is a whole different sort of field, which deserves its own attention and merit and discussion. But it is kind of to make something out of the experience that would potentially serve us in our development, in our well-being. So
Mhm.
fundamentally to increase our well-being and to make us more attuned to where we are, what we want, and how we can kind of get there. So this is the bias. Some people maybe not, don't share that, and then they see different sorts of, they see like psychedelic experiences could be beneficial for their like hedonic character alone or whatnot. But for me personally, also for my foundation, this is an important value to kind of make something out of the experience and to kind of increase fundamentally one's own well-being. And yeah, there are different ways to go about doing that, different sorts of modalities and ways of integrating an experience, and it's an attitude as much as it's a process.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And actually, of course, I haven't done your full training. I done obviously the beginning part, you can say the introduction. But one part I really noticed and also have kind of seen in my own work is there's obviously different ways of doing this. There's a individualistic way where maybe we do it ourselves, then maybe we have a therapist, and it's very much our own process. And there's doing it in a more social, integrated way, which I kind of can say what we did at the Mind Foundation was obviously social. It was done in a group, right? And I think I had done a lot of my own personal, more in an individual way, just myself and maybe one therapist there. While it was really interesting to notice the profound impact of also doing it in a group, right? And even I remember we were doing our paintings after the meditation you facilitated, and then we shared those stories, and even being able to share these stories with other people and being heard somehow was quite profound. Um, so yeah, I'm just curious also about, maybe you could speak a little bit to this, that, and of course you're right, we all have individual preferences. It's not about there's a right or wrong way, but just these different ways of engaging with integration.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for the question, and I think it makes sense here a little bit to present what's specific, for example, about mind's approach to integration, because it's a lot of it's a lot of there is a lot of evidence base for it, and it has a specific rationale and different sort of modalities, and these are kind of like remembering, structuring, exploring, practicing, and sharing. And why they're
Mm.
important, I mean, as you could see, for example, in the Beyond Experience workshop that you also did, which is kind of the stepping stone. It's mainly for the general public interested in participating in an integration workshop, in learning how to integrate their own experience in a group context. So
Yeah.
basically, one of the exercises was the lifeline, where we kind of went into a meditation, guided meditation, visualization. And the purpose behind the whole thing was, first of all, yeah, to remember. So remembering leads to kind of anchoring, but also kind of re-experiencing and exposure to the experience. So that's an important component. And then basically you can have the ability to structure in the lifeline and to confront with your past, with certain issues, and give some order and create something new out of it. And then ultimately, yeah, you can also explore like different ways of presenting it. And the sharing, which is the group part, is I think, for me personally, when I did my Beyond experience, was one of the most beneficial and touching things, because not only, as you said, did I work with with a therapist or with a friend or just on my own, but I managed to be seen by a large group of people that all underwent through similar but also very different experiences. And this was kind of quite cathartic for me and helpful in my journey. And I think that like the group process is definitely also one of our kind of um, key, I don't know, trademarks of the workshop and why it's important, but also kind of the scientifically and research backed approach to it. So it's not what I've seen in kind of integration workshops out there is like there's this attitude of wanting them to be very spontaneous and intuitive and just allowing for whatever is, which is fine. It's a good approach. But I feel that also having a structure and having kind of like an explanation for why each part is chosen and why it is integrated in that way, and for the facilitators to have a good understanding of that, and to still like guide the process as if it's very natural, but still have the structure behind, I think that provides a lot of value to participants, and we have heard it in feedback from people across the years.
I resonate a lot with that, Victor. And I think part of what's important also, I think, when processing in a social space, integration is really to have safe holding, right? So I think the people holding the space has a huge impact on the outcome, because I've been in groups where it's clear people don't feel safe and it's not particularly beneficial. And then, I've been in other groups, one of yours were one of them with the Mind Foundation, where we all felt so safe, and it was very, very easy to then get benefit out of it. So I think, at least for me, and you might have different opinion, this element of safety is probably number one for any kind of integration processing to go well. And what I really liked also when you described this exercise I was talking about was that there is both an internal element, because you started with the meditation, which is very internal, right? Going inside, noticing, and then there's a social element as well, right? Um, and I think it is important to integrate that social element, especially in this very individualized society where we tend to think we should do everything on our own. And I know I was very much like that. Um, but
Mm.
we can't forget that a lot of trauma is social, right? It happened in connection or disconnection, breach of trust with others. So part of the re-emerging again and coming together and building trust is also, I think, doing that socially, which is why I really like that component. But I'm really curious, and obviously, as we then embark on these journeys of integration, what are some of the challenges that people might experience? I know you said yourself that you obviously had challenges after your really intense experience, and it took several years. So what are some things maybe people can start thinking about so they can, I guess, prepare as well as possible?
Mm. That's actually a very good question, and I'm going to try to, since my experience also had certain elements that were not necessarily unique, but they were kind of, they are very rare to encounter, and I'm trying to kind of like summarize out of them what are things that I've also seen people generally encounter. And I think the challenges after psychedelic experiences, be they especially in like certain retreat settings or in recreational settings where maybe not, even if due care is given to the most important safety issues, there's still, I think, the sense of overwhelm is one particular challenge, because you can go out of the experience and you have this like sense of, whoa, I've experienced something that's new to me.
Yeah.
As you said, both you and I, we both had like maybe a certain kind of mentality, a certain kind of
Hmm.
rigidity in the way we operated, like psychological
Hmm.
rigidity. And obviously, in the integration work, we cultivate psychological flexibility, but the process of opening up to that can involve a sense of overwhelm. Like, what do I do with all this new information, with all these insights? How can I now, like, live my life day to day? How do I experience? How do I express my emotions? And that's also kind of deeply tied with isolation, or with kind of difficulty in communication with others. And that's something that I've seen also in the only research piece I published so far was basically the transformational potential and the integration challenges of experiences with LSD and psilocybin in the Romanian population. I did a study a few years
Hmm.
ago on that, and those were the key things that came out. So the sense of overwhelm, the isolation component, so feeling misunderstood by others, or kind of isolated because the people that they didn't have that experience that you had, most of the people in your circle, and then you don't know how to communicate about it, or you do open up, but they don't know how to hold space in a safe way for you, and you're being end up being judged. And these two, and I think, like, to kind of wrap up the whole structure, there will be also the implementing change part. So struggling to translate these profound insights that you had in actual day-to-day changes, which is one of the most important parts of the integration process, and also of what we try to do at Mind. So how do you really translate? For example, you had a very strong vision in which you saw yourself as I don't know, with your lungs being black, all black and decaying, and you felt a very strong emotion with that. Like, what do you do with that? Do you just take it as a strong experience, or do you realize that that might be a nudge into the direction of like changing a habit in your life? So this, and last but not least, a high degree of emotional volatility, I would say. It's emotional volatility because, especially for the people who are having these experiences more often in a recreational setting, I've encountered that a lot also with younger people. They have every 2 weeks or 3 weeks an experience, and they wonder why they can't seem to find a sense of balance. Well, if you're overstimulating your nervous system and your receptors without kind of due regard of like, when do they reset, what's a kind of an appropriate time between experiences, how can you do the integration work, then you'll be in a state of emotional volatility with ups and downs. And I've also experienced, I'm talking also from personal experience, I don't want to judge anyone. I myself have made probably most of the mistakes one can make in the integration process. And I always recommend people to go about with an attitude of kindness to themselves in this process.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, to have that sense of self-compassion, right? That we are going to make mistakes. It's not a perfect process, even if we have training. As you said, you have a lot of knowledge and experience, and yes, you also have made mistakes, right? I have made mistakes, and again, just meet that with compassion. And you kind of mentioned this element again of feeling misunderstood. Again, I guess that's a social component, right? That we are social beings, so therefore, and this is something I often talk to people about, is the importance in the planning stage of making sure there is good social support in place, whether that's a group, whether it's friends, whether it's a Mind Foundation. It's just making sure before you do it, and you might have different opinion. This is just what I normally say to people, that to try and plan and ensure, do I have safe social support in place, right? Because even though we can do it alone, I think it's definitely safer and more effective to have social support in place, right? And especially if you want long-term benefits. I don't know how you feel about this.
I would tend to agree a lot with that, although I must be transparent about it. That's not how I proceeded to begin with. I had very
Mm,
little, so I did most of the experiences on my own because I realized I had
mhm,
little trust in exposing myself so vulnerably with others. Perhaps
mm,
because I was not exposed to safe ways of communicating or safe spaces. I don't know the reasons, but I didn't do that so much in the beginning, and that led to certain consequences. And I
mhm,
saw that from when I started to also engage the social aspect more and the feedback, getting this feedback from also different sorts of people, not just people
mhm,
that confirm your bias. Because that's another trend I saw, like people to have
mhm,
these experiences and then to go within the psychedelic subculture or a certain kind of esoteric subculture, which there's nothing
mhm,
wrong to explore everything that is of interest, but like that you kind of can have like a more insular mentality where
mhm,
you don't, it's harder to see your own biases and where you do bypassing, because spiritual
yeah.
bypassing or bypassing in of itself is another key challenge in the integration process. And usually
Yes.
the mirroring and the reflection by a group of diverse individuals can really help see these things without having someone to point out it's you. Like you do that. You see it in the mirror reflection of others.
That's a really good point, actually, you bring up around the bias and also, I guess, the spiritual bypassing. And I have seen, often if there's spiritual bypassing, it's almost like chasing one experience after the next, after the next, after the next, and get this feeling, oh, I'm aligned with everything. Um, and even I had a discussion with somebody who talked about the conscious community, and I say, what does it even mean? Does it mean we're more conscious? I said, and other people, I said, even in that we can limit ourselves a lot, I think, in building this framework that we know more than others because we are engaging in this. Because I don't think we necessarily do. I think, again, like you said, there are different perspectives. So I think it's a really good point what you said, to expose ourselves to lots of different people and not get narrowed down just in one group that maybe support all the things that we say, or glorify what we say. So that's actually a
Ex-
really good point. Thank you for bringing that up, Victor. I wanted to talk to you.
Exactly.
Yeah, is that
Just
what you
a
meant?
little bit on that. Yeah. And this is the old age thing. Like just one more trip, one more LSD experience, and everything will be all right. You know, it's,
That's when you know they're not doing the integration. But yeah, it's a good point. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about the harm reduction as well, right? Because we talked a bit about what to do with integration. And of course, people can seek more information on your website as well if they want more in-depth details. Um, but I think it's also important to just discuss maybe some of the key things that people should just consider or be a bit aware of before they even take a psychedelics, right? What may be some things that would be good for people to consider to kind of reduce potential risk of things, not going so well or being very, very challenging?
Mm, mm, yeah, that's a very important question. And fortunately, I did when I did my own experimenting many years ago. When I started, I also kind of was a bit aware of this importance of set and setting. So what set and set is basically you have to have a good mind state in which you want to do that experience with, because most of the time
Mhm.
psychedelics will potentiate, perhaps also can potentiate the mind state you're in. So if you're in a period in which you feel you don't really feel all that great and you feel like anxious and in a rush and like you cannot stay, perhaps it's a good idea to kind of delay the experience. And then setting
Mhm.
refers to your environment. Where do you want to do it? Do you want to do it in a place in which you feel safe with someone that you feel safe with, which it would be ideal? Or do you feel like you could do it at a festival with thousands of people around you and with all sorts of possibilities for things to go wrong? Does the festival have a harm reduction tent? Are they kind of, or an integration tent? Are there people aware there? So, especially
Mhm.
for people who do their first experience, I think like a proper set and setting and guidance are very important, like to also ensure that there is someone to help there, like from a basic trip sitter, like which is could be a friend that knows a little bit about that, all
Mhm.
the way down to in the countries where this legal framework permits an integration coach, or even better, maybe an integration therapist that could be there and support the process. And obviously, I mean, a big part at mine are also connected with the medical side, to also have a bit of a medical history checkup, because psychedelics, while they can be in the right set and setting and circumstances, could be beneficial for some people, they're definitely not beneficial for all people. And some people actually can have very strong adverse reactions. And there are many different things to really consider before that, to not go into problems, especially if one is taking certain sorts of medications, and or as having certain sorts of diagnoses in the family. So these are really important on
Mhm.
one side, and then obviously the substance and its purity. You have to know, okay, what you're taking, are you sure? Who told you that that substance is that? For example, now in Berlin, I live in Berlin, and I see, like, I will look at reports from substances that are tested at clubs here. The nightlife is really um, intense, and they have this clubs in which they test sometimes the substances, and you could see that they're not the substances that's advertised many times, or even more dangerously, it can be laced with, even I saw with something like fentanyl, which can be
Mhm.
in a very small doses even deadly. And then how do you know the dosage? Do you weigh it? Do you eyeball it? Do you eyeball? Okay, if you eyeball ketamine, okay, maybe it can be harder to go that much wrong, but it's still very much possible and not recommended. But then for something like 2CB, if you eyeball 2CB, you can very easily go into a dose that's extremely overwhelming. So I think these are like setting guidance, medical history, and substance purity and dosage are like some very basic things that one needs to consider
These are some really good
for
points.
harming.
So thank you, Victor. Really good. I think four solid points right here. And I also know when I was at the Mind Foundation, you had these test kits. I think they're manufactured by a German company, if I'm right, startup. Um, yeah, so maybe we can put
Yeah.
that in a link description or something like that, because I think that's a really good way where people can test some of these substances, right? And make sure, I think, how much is in and the purity, etc. Um, so yeah, again, I don't know if is that something you think would be a good idea for people to do if they're gonna do this, to use some of these test kits.
Oh, most certainly. I mean, I would not recommend anyone taking any substance without testing it. And obviously, I mean, this in the context in do it in a legal context, in a context that's safe. So the legal side of things has to also be considered as well. It's an important aspect. And yeah, this is something that's also evolving at the European level as well, hopefully, in different sorts of countries, but it's slowly evolving. You know?
Yes. And it's interesting. I wanted to just discuss, because this is something I normally talk about people with, if they come and ask for advice, and I love to hear obviously your input on it. So often, what I have tried to discuss or recommend to people is actually to have both a potential, if they can afford it, of course, a therapist that they work with, that they build up trust with, who's willing to be a sitter and be there with them and guide them through it, and also have, if they have one, of course, a long-term safe attachment. And this could be a family member, partner, friend,
Mm,
because that way they have both the therapeutic intervention if needed, and somebody who has expertise, but they also have somebody who's a long-term secure attachment, right? And I think having, at least what I have seen, and this is my own bias, which is why I'm asking, also what you think of this, it gives both the long-term secure attachment, and somebody who, for example, can come and give them cuddles if they need that maybe a professional cannot do for ethical reason, and it gives the professional expertise. So I kind of think, if it's possible, it's a nice way to maximize the benefit. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
mm. No, I can agree. Actually, in my process, I didn't have a therapist to support me, but I did have some secure attachments, long-term attachments, which were definitely very helpful in certain situations. And I would say maybe I add a third element to this to make it like, if someone wants to go like full circle and like very very safe and tackle as many things as possible, to have the therapist, the secure attachment, and an integration sharing circle or group of people that
Yes.
are on the path and have this kind of the sangha or community aspect of the whole thing. You know?
Yes, beautiful. And then, that's what I did. And I'm still surprised how much I benefited. But I think I had these three elements you talked about now. I actually had a therapist. I had one of my closest friends there purely for emotional, support and create safety. And then afterwards, I also have group where I could share it with. And I think it was so beneficial, which is why I said it might be my bias. But, for me, that seemed like the most optimal way, at least from my own personal experience. So it's interesting to hear you say that as well. And there's one thing I wanted to discuss because I remember at the training with the Mind Foundation, you showed us, and you were kind enough to share it with me, this diagram or whatever it's called, graph of different substances that we should be careful mixing. And I think it's still important to mention because not many people who are doing psychedelics is aware of this, right? And it was super helpful for me when you shared that and bring awareness the fact that some mixture of different components is actually can be quite risky. I wonder if that's just something you can speak to a little bit. Of course, we can't go through the whole diagram, but maybe just mention a little bit about this.
Yes. So first of all, I think you can also feel free to put the link to the diagram from tripsit.me in the description for people to actually check out. But it's basically the yes, as you said, some substances don't really go so well with others, and all subs or most substances interact in some way. It can be potentiating, like augmenting the experience. It can be kind of taking the edge off or going in kind of a more um, down. So it can be up, going increasing the intensity, decreasing the intensity, which again, there is where we have to factor in certain risks, but things can also go much more dangerous in terms of combinations that create potentially deadly or lethal or life-threatening situations. For example, there are certain things in ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is quite popular, and ayahuasca contains basically, it says the active ingredients are dimethyltryptamine or DMT and a monoamino oxidase inhibitor. And basically, if there are certain things, like for example, antidepressants, SSRIs, that should not be combined with those monoamino oxidase inhibitors. And we can go into many different sorts of directions. But for example, stimulants like cocaine, speed, etc., can increase, if combined with a psychedelic, they can kind of increase heart rate, anxiety, and it can more easily lead into these kind of paranoia loops of paranoia or anxiety. And on the other end, depressants like benzodiazepines could actually, I mean, they are used in emergency settings sometimes to kind of calm the person down, but at the same time, it really hampers the integration process. So some people I heard, they take, let's say, they take LSD, and with LSD in higher dosages, it can be quite hard to fall asleep. So then they basically, after a certain number of hours, they take a benzo to fall asleep. Well, that's not something I would recommend because also memory gets kind of messed up with in this process, and also the
Mm.
integration of the experience is not natural; it's not smooth. So yeah, I mean, we can go a lot into discussion with these things. I think the most important thing is for people to be aware of these interactions, to consult the charts, and ideally to not combine substances. I mean, there have to be like very good reasons why one should combine substances. I personally rarely do, and these reasons should be informed by like an intention and not by the fact that it's cool to mix certain things together. There's this whole trend of like the hippie flip, the candy flip, the Jedi flip, the God flip, and all like different combinations of taking like MDMA and mushrooms, MDMA and LSD, MDMA and mushrooms and LSD, and MDMA and mushrooms, LSD, and on top of that also taking DMT. So what does that say about like the motivations and the intention of the person? I don't know. It seems a bit undirected to me, and maybe perhaps thrill seeking and not really kind of mindful of the power of each of these components on their own. Yeah.
And that this is so important. And of course, you're right. We can't go over all the different combinations, but I think even this, you have brought awareness to something, right? And there's a chart, and people can speak to health professionals. So I just wanted to bring attention to it because it was really impactful when you started talking about it. I remember at this little training long weekend. So now people at least know, and they can go check. Because as you said, there's two things to really look out for: the purity you mentioned earlier of the
Yeah.
compound, which people obviously can get test kits for. The second part is, try to prevent mixing, and just stick to one thing, because it's simply safer. And if for whatever reason you must do it, then at least check the chart to make sure you don't do something that could be very high risk. So that's all I really wanted to just bring attention to here. And you did that perfectly, Victor. Um, so I wanted to just speak to you a little bit about the different types of psychedelics, because it's a broad word, right? That obviously encompasses a lot of different substances. And it might even be a bit confusing for people where to start if they're curious but don't really know. We have magic mushrooms, psilocybin, we have MDMA, we have LSD, we have ayahuasca, DMT, it goes on and on. Would you be able, probably not to talk about all of them, but just some of them, and how they might be slightly different?
So here again, there are different sorts of perspectives of seeing and looking at that, and there's different sorts of research. So what I would say is that there are like these also these classical psychedelics. So classical psychedelics would be seen like as LSD, mushrooms of psilocybin containing mushrooms like psilocybin cubensis, because psilocybin is the active ingredient in the magic mushrooms. And basically these more classical psychedelics, and there are these more kind of some substances which some people consider psychedelics and others not, like MDMA, which is main ingredient in ecstasy, or ketamine. Some more atypical psychedelics, and obviously like ayahuasca is a formulation that contains DMT, which is DMT is the psychedelic part, and combined with the yahe or ayahuasca vines, which actually contain the monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which allow actually ayahuasca to be the DMT to be active. Because if you were to take orally DMT, if you were to eat it, nothing would happen, because the enzymes in your stomach would break it down before it enters it goes to the blood in the brain, so it have no effect. Now I think from a neuroscientific point of view, you can look at what substances influence what receptors. And here, most of the classical psychedelics influence the serotonin or 5-H, but 2A, the 2A receptor. Some influence the B receptor, so that they can have different sorts of impacts on different sorts of receptors. But as long as it's the serotonin receptor, we're talking about more classical psychedelics with the 2A receptor. Then ketamine, for example, works on NMDA receptor, if I'm correct. MDMA also kind of releases serotonin in a different sort of way. Yeah, so all these substances can work also a bit differently. I think I'm not sure kind of how it's such a complex thing to summarize. I think people should really be like look at the different sorts of risks and benefits associated and also researched by people before, and not think so much about in terms of the substance that LSD is doing that, or psilocybin is doing that, because there was some research, I don't remember the authors, but that said that basically at the 3-hour mark, people given LSD or psilocybin, they couldn't really tell accurately which one was which. Obviously, by the 6-7 hour mark, you realize, because one lasts longer, which is maybe another component that's important to consider. Like, how long do you want your experience to last? Do you want it to be extremely short, 5 minutes, as in the case of DMT, but extremely intense? Or do you want it to be more longer, perhaps less intense? But also, this also depends on the dosage. So I would say the psychedelic, the duration and the dosage are kind of like key components to look at, and then do individual
Yeah, so
research on them. Yeah.
So this is a really good overview, Victor. Thank you. And again, it just gets people started. And I kind of think, like what you said, which makes a lot of sense. That magic mushroom, which psilocybin active component, LSD, are very similar, and I think work very similar on the receptors as well, right? It's just LSD obviously works longer, so that's a consideration, right? And especially if you're not used to psychedelics, maybe it's a good thing to start with something that works not so long, right? Like maybe the psilocybin, just because at least if you don't have a good experience, you get out of it faster. Um, and again, and you might have a different perspective on this, but people that are curious to explore and ask me about DMT, I would normally say I would not do this as a first time you try something, because it can be so intense, even though it's very quick, so intense. So it just seems safer to start with something less. And this is just, of course, my opinion. This is not scientific, but it seems more safe to start with something like psilocybin that is definitely less intensity, right? And even for if people want to do therapy doing when they're on psychedelics, and something like MDMA seem to be quite a good option, because again, you don't tend to go off in hallucination or other things like that. You seem to still be quite present and able to process, which might be a bit harder with some of the others. But I'd love to hear your input on this as well.
Sure, sure. So first of all, I mean, all I'm saying, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a psychopharmacologist. I might have even gotten some of the names of the receptors slightly wrong. But what I do recommend for people is to check our molecules course, which is an in-depth, almost graduate level program that leads you to all these things, like from the basics of the psychedelics and different sorts of substances, down to even like a specialist understanding of what's the difference between an agonist of the serotonin receptor and an antagonist, and kind of if one also has curious intellectual mind, it can really spur in the understanding of these things. So I would recommend that. And to get to more directly to your question, I think, for example, why would MDMA be a better choice in certain cases? Well, we need to understand how MDMA works. And MDMA basically releases serotonin, but also kind of blocks the amygdala. And amygdala is, from what I understand, the center where kind of like emotions like fear are being processed. So obviously it is harder, though not impossible, to have an experience with fear on MDMA or with anxiety. Usually that doesn't necessarily happen, although it can be the case. So it's much easier maybe to work with, say, you don't have that fear and you have all this kind of serotonin first into your flowing into your body, in your brain, and you might feel it's easier to deal with certain things that were harder in the past. But that really depends a lot. And I would say if one is looking for psychedelics for therapeutic purposes, they should consult their therapist or psychiatrist or a qualified professional to give them advice on that, and not to kind of basically, in a way, I cannot say because I did that myself. I kind of looked around and I saw MDMA as the best option. But if I were to do things again, I would have probably had a discussion with a professional about these things. Now, fortunately, they're starting to appear more and more, or get in touch with someone like the Mind Foundation or other like Open Foundation. There are different sort of also organizations that impart knowledge about these things, and try to see, okay, what do I want to do? And yeah, I think generally speaking, DMT is extremely intense. So maybe for a first timer might not be the ideal experience, but then again, it also lasts a shorter amount of time. Some people might, in an inappropriate setting, you probably would rather want to be a shorter amount of time on DMT, although you would want to avoid that altogether. So I think it's hard to give like a generalization. Yes, one should like first trip
Yeah.
should not definitely not be DMT, but it is rather uncommon, and it is something that leaves people very perplexed and with almost very little memory to process. Because what happens when we go into these profoundly altered states of consciousness, we do not have necessary reference in our mind stream of what these states are, so we cannot really map them, and we return together and we're like, oh, wow, and cannot really remember or say much of what has happened. And the whole point, like the starting point of integration process, is remembering the experience.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point, actually, again, because if it's something that is so foreign from the concept of what we understand as reality, but we don't have a clear memory, it can almost leave somebody in confusion, just a state of confusion, right? Which is not necessarily a very stable place to come back to. Um, but I also hear your point that there's no fixed guidelines. It's obviously different depending on the setting, the person, which is valid. And I really want to talk a little bit about some of the misunderstandings around psychedelics or misinformation, right? And I think a good example here that I can give is somebody who came and said to me, "Oh, couples when they're in trouble, they just need to take MDMA." And then they're going to fall in love again, right? And I said, well, this is a bit of a oversimplification. And again, I don't think this is completely a correct classification, that MDMA just makes everybody feel in love again and makes everything great in relationships. I think it opens up a space to have honest communication and honest conversations. And that could be that people fall in love again. It could also be they become finally clear that they were not being good together, right? So I would just want to talk to you in general about some of these. This was just an example, right? Somebody said to me, but some of these misunderstandings that might be around psychedelics, or maybe we can clarify a few of them.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. We can start with yours. It's a very good example. I think you're correct. I mean, mostly MDMA can, in the right setting, with ideally with the therapist as well, can provide a space where one clings less to their right and kind of is more open to seeing the perspective of the other and having like this conversation. But if they're used also in a more kind of romantic setting, yes, they do make you much more open in that moment, but it also
Mm-hmm.
leads potential for more problematic situations because you can have certain boundaries without MDMA and others with MDMA. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have like a clear conversation around these things, you can end up breaking someone's boundaries on MDMA much easier. So I think it's definitely not the magical quick fix for relationship, and it's definitely not a substitute for couples therapy, which is also like, you don't need to do that, you just take some MDMA. I was like, okay, that doesn't seem like very sound advice. Um, another another thing, I mean, also some of the more, I mean, there's a common myth that certain psychedelics cause brain damage. There is no, as far as I know, there is no scientific evidence in that direction. They actually are relatively safe. Um,
Mm-hmm.
then also there are many misconceptions on psychedelics addictive potential. So some go into like, oh, psychedelics are definitely not addictive. They're used to treat addiction. Okay, that there is some truth to this statement, but then it depends on what psychedelics and also on the dosage. So even with classical psychedelics that usually are not habit forming, if one takes very small doses all the time, they can become, at least not in physical addiction, but that can be like a psychological addiction to kind of being in that state and kind of self-medicating with a little bit. Yes, obviously you couldn't do it with large doses. I haven't heard of people and that took like every weekend 500 micrograms of LSD, 1,000 micrograms of LSD. Maybe there are. I haven't heard of that. Um, but then other substances, for example, like MDMA, can be highly addictive, or ketamine can be very addictive if used in an improper setting with misdirected motivations or intentions. You can end up becoming addicted to them in similar ways as to other substance classes that are more generally considered very addictive. So there are misconceptions there. And I think probably one of the biggest misconceptions is the whole thing that they're a quick fix. Like, oh, you just take psychedelics and it will all be fine soon, or this is like the shortcut. And honestly, especially to people that I meet and they say that they have, I've had this experience and I see everything. Well, honestly, it's just the beginning of the path in most cases. So it's the first step. It's definitely not the last. And they're not a quick fix. And without the proper integration work, there is no, I mean, science doesn't say that there's any sort of real kind of benefit without all those things. At least that's still a controversial thing, but I would venture to say that without proper integration, proper values, and ethical kind of treatment of the whole thing, it might actually even make certain things worse. We need to be like, I think, not there's a lot of hype in the psychedelic community about like, yeah, let's make psychedelics more popular, and I can understand that. I was myself very much in favor, and I still am obviously advocating for some forms of its usage. But I think we should also be kind of agnostic in the sense of like being open to see, okay, what does research show? Because if it shows that certain things are more dangerous or that actually contribute less to our well-being or even do harm, we should be open to consider to not do these things. So I think that's like in the spirit of like scientific inquiry and empiricism, we need to be very aware of that.
Yeah, and this is really important, Victor. So I'm happy you bring it up, and it's what I really like about you and the Mind Foundation is that you have a really balanced, I think, approach to this, which is not overhyping, but also the openness and curiosity to the benefits, right? And I think that's a really good place for us to be and continue to explore these substances because I think you are right. I meet people that are, oh, this is a horrible, these are drugs. How could you do this? Which are against everything, right? And are not open to the potential positive benefits that science is starting to show. And then there's the other side, which is like you said, oh, psychedelics will solve everything, right? And I had somebody who came to me and just had a relationship breakup after being together for 2 years and said, oh, Thomas, I want to take psilocybin magic mushroom. Can you help me? And I said, no. And she said, oh, but I feel sad. I said, good. That's a healthy response to just having experienced loss. I said, go speak to a therapist. If you struggle to deal with it, spend time with supportive friends and family. That's a good place to start. Yeah. To try and process before thinking that every time things are difficult, I have to take a psychedelics, right? So again, like I said, what I really like about the Mind Foundation is this balanced perspective that you bring, which I think is a super important message. So thank you for sharing that, Victor. And
Mm.
I guess my last question, because I know we've been talking almost for an hour, is what do you kind of see as the future now? So, of course, there's a lot of research happening. It's an exciting period for us. After it's been banned, maybe it will become legalized in more countries. What do you kind of see as a future for this space that we're in?
Hmm. That's a very hard question because I can see different sorts of answers based on one's geography. For example, I see a different future maybe in Europe than in the US. Maybe different sorts of tracks towards adoption and legalization. It might be quicker it might happen quicker in the US. We're also obviously hoping for hopefully for a phase 3 clinical trial with psilocybin here in Europe that would kind of pave the way to it being adopted in the publicly funded healthcare system as well. But I think that there's quite a road to there with many sorts of struggles and many processes and many challenges, and some of them we at Mind also are trying to overcome and are trying to kind of be do something in that direction. I see that, or at least my hope is that more and more people, because we have quite a larger proportion of rational people in our population, and I feel that any sort of rational human being that would look objectively or as objective as possible to the evidence for psychedelics would at least realize, okay, this is probably not crystal meth. This is not crystal meth. This is not something that should be banned in that way, or should be maybe controlled in different ways, and people should need. I wouldn't necessarily want to have like all psychedelics to be bought like in a candy store that can also create other dangers, but there could be like permits in place. There could be like way more. There will be, I think, way more methods to talk about these things, more information, more possibilities for integration, also more possibilities to experience these things in countries that will legalize. I mean, the Netherlands has these experiences. There are some countries that have decriminalized these substances, and basically there is a kind of a gray area of also having retreats in those countries. So I feel that there will be more openness to the experiential side, to more openness to understanding kind of what these things are and making informed choices on this based on science and based on evidence and not based just on one's biases or kind of preconceptions. But at the political level, especially in Europe, it will be not an easy battle because it's not a topic that politicians want to address so easily, because it comes with so much load. And I think an important message for all of us is to learn also from the mistakes from the 60s, from, let's say, the first wave, bigger wave of this, and not be too like, let's spread psychedelics everywhere. No, let's really look how, in what conditions they're good, in what conditions they're not so good, in what conditions should we avoid them. And let's be as honest as possible and transparent as possible with that, because then if we truly believe that in their potential, if they are actually good, that will manifest. That's at least my belief. So I do hope to see more openness and more the research and also more application and implementations. And with I myself personally in what I do and also in my work at Mind and especially the work of Mind, is going into that direction, into bringing it into the mainstream. That's a crucial difference. It's not just kind of catering more and more to people that are already like preaching to the converted and already in the choir, which is not a bad thing. But how can we actually bring these things into the mainstream and to have them as serious alternatives to certain treatments and to certain modalities, especially in therapeutic care, but also for
Yeah,
human development as well.
thank you, Victor. And I think kind of what I heard you say, or this is my interpretation of it, is also this thing around it's about responsible use, meaning that, as you said, in the 60s, 70s, where it was everywhere, this is partly why the crackdown obviously happened by governments, was that it was kind of irresponsible use, right? It was something we would take whenever we wanted to get out and have a high experience. While what the Mind Foundation is advocating more is how to use it mainstream, but in a responsible way that's backed by science as well. And I think that's a really important message, because if it start becoming legalized and we start misusing it again in the same way, we might go back to square one, right? So I
Yeah,
think it's really
right.
important for people, whether they do it underground or in places where it's legal, to try and just ask themselves this question: is this responsible use, right? Because if we want
Hmm.
this legalized, we have to also start showing that, it's like when your parents allow you to drink. If you show you can do it responsibly, it's more likely they will allow it than if you get trashed and sick every weekend, right? So yeah, I think that's an important message. And what I want to just say before we finish up is I would love if you could just share a bit about people who want to know more, where they can find the Mind Foundation. I know you guys are run as a charity and are doing a lot of amazing work, but also on very restricted budgets. So maybe people want to support what you're doing, and donate. So could you just describe a little bit of information how people find you guys? And of course, we'll leave links in the description below as well.
Oh, sure, Thomas. Thank you so much for this. It's true that we are a charity, and we try from our programs to generate as much revenue as possible. But we're still in need of donations from philanthropists, as well as from people that are interested in contributing to the space in any way. So for that, we do have like a donate button on our website, and we also have a campaign. And we'll leave, as you said, we'll leave the links for the people there. And really, any amount is beneficial, and it will go towards our psychedelic education and harm reduction programs, but also to fund potential future research and kind of bringing this whole message and this whole kind of responsible attitude towards responsible and science-informed attitude around psychedelics to the general public. This is my specialty, and I think that it is very much welcome from people, and we do welcome it. So thank you
Thank
for
you, Victor.
bringing
And I
that up,
just
Thomas.
Of course, it's an important point, because if we want to continue the development of this, we have to support the people doing the research and helping spread safe use and information. So if you guys, the listeners, like the Mind Foundation, go check out their website and the podcast, and yeah, spread the word, because it's important that we keep organizations like the Mind Foundation going and running if we want this to become legalized, and also make sure we have a safe and good framework for use, and are able to train therapists in the future. And I have no affiliation with the Mind Foundation whatsoever. I have no financial benefits. I've just had an experience with Victor and the Mind Foundation, and was really, really impressed with a balanced view of how they do this work. So yeah, I really encourage you guys to go there, donate, support them if you align with this. So Victor, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge and your time here. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for this opportunity, Thomas. It was touching also to witness you in the workshop and to have these exchanges with you. And thank you so much for all the possibility to express myself and to and for seeing mind and our work for what it is, as trying to bring this balance of the many different perspectives. And I think that people are welcome to join us in our workshops and get to know us better. So if you're not sure about donating, or no, just come to get to know us. And if you resonate, then do it. And if it's right for you, and otherwise, no. I mean, there has to be like a resonance for that, and there has to be like a mutual understanding. So we really encourage you
Yes.
to also get to know us in our Beyond Experience workshops and other integration workshops. And if someone is like a therapist and looking to do a formation in like a 1.5 year specialist training in psychedelic augmented therapy, then we also recommend that.
And I think that start next year, right? If I'm right, the
No,
training.
so that will be that's a different program. But what we already have running is for therapists and medical professionals that are interested in
Okay.
that. That's kind of like a very in-depth 1.5 year course with lots of intensive weeks experience theory that's addressed for them. And for the more general public, from next year we hope to be able. It's really depending a lot on donations to implement any not new programs because we're such a
Of
small
course.
team. But we hope to implement also kind of a psychedelic integration facilitated course more for the general public to learn, like to expand, to take the beyond experience workshop and expand into more of like the nitty gritties and the structures and how to support certain processes, also for people that are not therapists or medical professionals.
Amazing, Victor. Thank you so much. And yeah, look forward to seeing you again, hopefully at some of the events with the Mind Foundation.
Yeah, hope to see you again too, and have a good day, Tom.